Hey, what is going on everyone? It's me, Mr. Mario, and in this video here, we're going to be doing a little bit of a, half fun, half tutorial related video, because I'm going to be showing you all if you have a hard-modded Xbox 360 Slim system. So this would be a Corona or a Trinity system. In my case, this is a Trinity, which has already been hard-modded with RGH, how you can move from having a glitch chip to no glitch chip. Really, this is going to be going from an older setup such as RGH2 over to RGH3. Now, the reason why I'm doing this here in my example is this system I've had up and running, and I'll even show you all real quick. This is running, it doesn't have like any hard drive in here, but this is reset glitch hacked because I can open up XEX menu. Once we get past that, boom, we're able to open this up, we're all good. So we are able to launch Homebrew on here, thankfully, and I can even open up dash launch, why not? I think here I have to go to the installer, that's it. Either way on this, and as you can see, this is a Trinity Glitch 2, I'm going to be updating this to RGH3 simply because we can do better what we're doing right now. You see, this system I have is currently a single NAND system. It is a system that I ended up modifying probably in 2013 or 2014, and the install isn't like my best work, but it's also not bad at the same time. However, this is using the original RGH2. Like, none of the added variants that we've had over these last few years, none of the awesome, community-driven versions of it. No, this is running like original Team Executor RGH2. This is running on a CoolRunner Rev C. I believe it's a legitimate one as well, too. The downside with it, though, is that even though it does work and it does boot, the boot times aren't really the best. In fact, I'm even going to show you all here. Let's see. I'm going to turn off the system, and let's see how long this takes to turn on. So I'm turning it on now, and we'll just see how long this takes. We're going to be at a black screen for a bit. Now, typically, if this is going to be insta-booting, it should take 5 seconds. Wow, and of course, it insta-boots when I want it to, or when I want it to mess up. Unbelievable. All right, so this is also kind of the nature of it as well, too. Sometimes it's going to insta-boot. Sometimes it's going to take, 5 or 6 cycles. I know right before this, I'll even try it again. Right before this, it took about a minute to boot up. So let's try this again. I'm going to turn on now. Let's see how long this takes, but either way, I do know that at least for this system, I really don't need a glitch chip here for what I'm doing, since this is a single NAND solution, and on top of that, we can have better boot times without the glitch chip, funny enough. So this is going to require a few things here. Of course, you're going to need a hard modded system, and you're also going to need to know how to solder in that regard, and you're going to need all the tools and such that you'll need for RGH3. So here we go, we finally had that booting up. Now, I'm not going to go into the super granular detail, but if you're just following along with this, you'll go ahead and see what I use here. If you're needing something much more verbose, I will have my RGH3 tutorials linked down below in the description, but I will say I'm only going to recommend this really for Slim owners. If you have a fat system and you're trying to go from like RGH1 or maybe RGH2 or RGH 1.2 over to RGH3, I don't recommend that for fat systems, just because RGH3 is unstable on fat systems, so it might not work for you and it could be a downgrade. But with Slims, in my experience, it's going to be an upgrade. So I've been doing a direct video capture here because we're actually going to do our first bit of work here on the system. Now, I am going to give a warning right here. This step right here is going to brick the system. And I am going to be breaking this on purpose because I know what I'm doing here and I know how to resolve this issue as well too. What we're going to do is we're actually going to update the system to RGH3 right off the bat. The reason why I'm going to be doing that is because I don't feel like soldering in a NAND programmer. I just feel like soldering in the wires. That's really all I want to do. However, in the worst case scenario, if RGH3 does not work on this system, I can easily resolder the chip, hook up my NAND programmer, and restore my NAND dump and have a working system. However, I am going to be trusting the process here, so what I will be doing is I'm first going to update this over to RGH3. Again, this is going to brick the system, but if you're willing to take the risk here, I would only recommend doing this if you have a NAND flasher on hand and you can solder it into the NAND points on your system in case it does not take with RGH3. So for this here, we're going to need a couple of downloads. We're going to go over to Octal's wonderful site, go over to downloads, and we're going to download the latest build of JRunner with extras. Right here, I'm just going to download the latest zip file and pop it onto my desktop. Next up, I'm going to go over to console mods to the updating your kernel dashboard section, and I'm going to download the latest build of Simple 360 NAND flasher. I'll go ahead and download it here and do the same thing. And we're also going to need a USB flash drive. So one thing you can do, which I have shown before, if you have a USB drive and you want to easily format it to make sure it works on the 360, it does need to be FAT32, but you can actually plug it into your system, go over to System, Storage, and then find your USB drive, press Y, and then format it right here. It will erase all the data on here, of course, but it will format it for the 360 and we can verify right now it is working. So let's go ahead, unplug this drive and move over to our computer. Alright, so the first piece of software we need is Simple 360 NAND Flasher, to which I'm going to right click this and extract it using 7-zip, which you can always download and install that over. Once I have this folder here, there we go, we have it inside of here. That's the default XEX. We can also check out the README if you so wish to. It is good to read over this. I'm not going to because I've read over this before, but just in case you don't know how that works. So I'm going to right click and copy out the Simple 360 NAND Flasher folder, go into our USB drive, right click and paste this, and it should just be right there. Again, you'll want to verify. You can always right click properties and just check that this is FAT32, and you can just format this on your computer if you need to, but if you format it on the Xbox, it'll work just fine. So with that, I'm going to right click, eject this, and take it back over to the console. Alright, so back over at the system, you can go ahead, plug in your USB drive, make sure it is detected, and from here we now need to launch Homebrew. Now you probably have a custom dashboard running such as Freestyle 3, Freestyle Dash, or Aurora. I don't have any of those as you can see, but I do have our good old friend XEX menu. So I'm going to go ahead, launch this. There we go. And I'm going to navigate over to the USB drive, find Simple 360 NAND Flasher, and launch the default.xex. Now, as you can see, it was able to save the CPU key, and I'm going to press X to dump the NAND. Thankfully, this doesn't take all too long, so I'm just going to wait a few moments to let it dump out onto the USB drive. And here we go, took 46 seconds, but I'll press any button to exit, and looks like we're done. So now once it exits out, you can unplug your USB drive and take it back over to your computer. Over at the PC, plug in your USB drive, go over to the drive, Simple 360 NAND Flasher, and we're going to need both of these, the CPU key and the flashdump.bin. I'm going to right click and copy both these out, and I'm going to make a new folder on my desktop. I'm going to call this one Trinity Slim, something like that, and paste the two files right here. Excellent. So I'm going to minimize out of that, minimize out of this, and now we need to extract out JRunner with extras. So you can right click this zip, and you can use something like 7-zip to extract it into its own folder. Once we're here, open up JRunner with extras and open up the JRunner executable. Now we're going to have to click on load source. Be sure to find your console, grab the flashdump.bin, and as you can see right here, it actually loaded up my CPU key. You would need to get the CPU key from your text file if you did not have it already, but it looks like I've worked on this PC before, so it was able to pull it from the key database. But either way, we can see the information right here that this is a 16 megabyte Trinity split CB. It is running 17559, so the latest kernel, and it is currently a glitch 2 image. Well, what we're going to do is we're going to create an RGH3 image. So you're just going to want to make sure the kernel version is the latest, because we can also update it in this fashion. Select glitch 2, check RGH3, and from here we're going to click on Create XE Build Image. Once that's been completed, we can navigate out to the folder that is showing in the Load Source page here. By default, it saves it over to the JRunner with Extras folder. Inside of here, for example, it has a folder with the serial number, and within this we now have our KV info, update flash, bin log, and the CPU key yet again. So what I'm going to do is just right click, copy out all of these, and I just pasted them into my Trinity Slim folder. So this is the file we need. We need this updateflash.bin. We can now right click, copy updateflash.bin, go to our USB drive, go into Simple 360 NAND Flasher, and we can paste this in here. We also no longer need the flashdump.bin, so we can delete that. But we have the update flash. Now again, keep this in mind. If you are following along with this as a tutorial, this step, I'm repeating it, this step is going to brick the console right now. It is going to brick it. So I would only recommend doing it this way here in this order if you have a NAND programmer that you can reflash from. And again, if you have a NAND programmer on hand and things go wrong, you can always rewire your glitch chip. You can reflash this flashdump.bin using the NAND programmer, and you should hopefully be okay to get your system to a working state at that point. But I'm really stressing this because this is not a software only method to convert to RGH3. That's not possible. After we do this, we are going to have to open up the system and rewire it. So with that, I'm going to right click, eject, and now we're back over at the console. So I'm going to go over to Games, launch XEX menu yet again, just so we can launch the Simple 360 NAND Flasher. Go in here, launch your default XEX, and it brought up all of our information. So we can now press A to flash our NAND, and at this point we can press start. I'm going to warn you all for the last time, this here is going to brick the system, so make sure you only do this if you're intending on opening up your system and you're capable of rewiring this to RGH3. If you're not going to be doing that, or you don't know how to do that, do not continue with this process. Since I am okay with purposefully bricking my system, let's go ahead and brick this. It also says here, as you can see, the console will reboot when it's done. When the console goes to reboot, just unplug it from power. Again, it's not going to be working properly once this NAND flash is done and the console reboots, but that is expected. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and just unplug it before it restarts. And with my console now thoroughly bricked, let's go ahead and open up this thing. As you can see, if you follow that order of operations and you tend to turn on the console now, it's going to turn on and then pretty much immediately reset, and you're going to run into something like this where you just cannot get any further. This is to be expected, and again, I'm doing it in this order of operations because I just don't want to hook up a NAND programmer. But a good thing to note here is that this did work by the end of this video, so RGH3 did work fine for this console here. So let's go ahead and get this all ripped apart. Now, I am going to say here, I have covered teardowns much more extensively in my other RGH3 related videos. I will have them linked down below in the description, and again, if you have done an install on a console like this, I would expect you probably know how to tear down your system, so we're just going to skip this here. However, you can now see that I do have the motherboard showing right here, and I do have the glitch chip in full glory. This is the part where you'll want to be. While we're getting everything prepared, let's go ahead and prepare our wires. So for this here, you're going to need a few things. You're just going to need some, I would recommend 30 gauge Kynar wire, wrapping wire, or just really some solid core wire. I personally really like 30 gauge Kynar wire as long as it is a solid core. You're also going to need a resistor. For Coronas, it would be recommended to use a 1000 ohm resistor, and for Trinities, it would be recommended to use any between 3000 to 10,000 ohms. So for this here, since this is a Trinity motherboard, I am going with a 10,000 ohm resistor. Now to prepare this, you're just going to take your wire and your resistor and make sure you trim down the resistor legs because they don't have to be this long here. So for your wire and your resistor on each one, you're just going to flux it with a little bit of flux, tin it with some solder, and then bring the wire and resistor leg together and solder them together. It shouldn't take all too long in that regard and should just be a pretty quick process. It also doesn't matter which orientation you have the resistor as long as it is connected and you have a length of wire on each leg. Now that a couple wires have been soldered to the resistor, you also need to make sure this is insulated. My preferred insulation technique is taking a little piece of heat shrink tubing and applying it here. So really all you need to do is get a small piece of heat shrink tubing, put it over the wire, and make sure you are sufficiently covering the resistor legs, and the joints that you have made with the resistor legs and the wire. At that point, you can then just apply some heat. For this, I'm going to use a barbecue grill lighter. Just keep it a bit of a distance away. Make sure that you are not actually setting this on fire, but you do want to make sure the heat is touching this so the heat shrink tubing does shrink around the resistor. Also, make sure this doesn't get hot enough to the point where it undoes your solder work. But once you get this all done here, it should look a little something like this. And once it is cool to the touch, you can also give it a little bit of a wiggle on each side to make sure your wires are still connected. Now that everything is connected here, at this point, your work here outside of the console is completed. Now let's take a look at this glitch chip install, just because I want to show you all this real quick. Yours might be different if you are following along, but this here is using a legitimate CoolRunner Rev C, and it is using RGH2, as I said. Now for anybody who might be yelling at me or complaining about the wires on here, like what I've done, I honestly have to say, I don't think it's all too bad, at least on the top of the board. And on the bottom of the board, if you see the blue wire, which is wrapped around the X-clamp legs right there, or the pegs for the heatsink, that is actually what we had to do back with the RGH2 days. I do not miss that at all, but it was in the instructions for those installs for the original implementation that this blue wire was cut to length. So they said, do not cut it at all. You're just going to have to wrap it around in a loop, but do not cut it. So that is why it was set up like this. Now that we've admired this, we're going to get rid of the old and we're going to introduce something new. And a part of that is we do have to remove the wires here. Now, I did realize after this that I probably could have just reused the wires, but I want to use just fresh wires overall. It's going to be up to you what you want to do, but all you need to do here is really just heat up your soldering iron and then touch your soldering iron to each of the points on the motherboard with the wires, and then quickly pull off the wires, but gently do it as well too, so you're not actually ripping up pads and traces. Just heat it up long enough so that it disconnects and you can pull the wire. So I've removed all the wires from the top of the motherboard. Now let's go ahead and flip it over, and we're going to do the exact same thing with the bottom two wires. I've gotten rid of the yellow one and the same thing with the blue one. Now with all of our points desoldered from the motherboard itself, we just have to remove the wires. From here, just do the same thing, go ahead, unfeed them, unloop them, and then you can come over to the glitch chip itself and just heat up each pad on the glitch chip and remove each wire gently. And once these are all removed, you should be good. I decided to go a little bit out of order, and I decided to remove the heatsink at this point using the trusty X-clamp removal tool. I absolutely love this tool, and I recommend it to anybody who asks about it. And it works up to even the Xbox Series S, so it is still a pretty recent tool that you can use in that sense. Now, all you need to do here is when you come to each leg on the heatsink itself that is secured by the X-clamp, you just need to pop it into the X-clamp itself. You don't want to be on top of it, you don't want to be underneath it where you're meeting the motherboard, but you're going to be in the middle. You pretty much slot it into the X-clamp itself. You then very gently pry upward. You don't want to use all too much force, and it's able to release that side of the X-clamp from one of the pegs. You can then go to another leg, do the same thing, and do the same thing one more time. And by the time you get to your fourth one, you should just be able to pop off the X-clamp without any tools. Once you pop that off, just gently remove the heatsink, but also make sure to disconnect it from the motherboard. You do not want to damage where the fan connects to the motherboard itself. So now let's work on cleanup and getting the chip removed, because we're not going to need this chip anymore. For this, the chip is secured with some double-sided adhesive on the bottom of the motherboard. And this is pretty much what I did. What I did was I just took some isopropyl alcohol, it is 99% isopropyl alcohol, and I sprayed it up on the top of the chip itself, just kind of underneath where it hits the motherboard, and I let it get underneath the chip and kind of let it saturate there. Yes, alcohol does get on the motherboard itself, but don't worry, it's going to be okay as long as we let it sufficiently dry. Now, once it was saturated well enough, I just came over here and I started to very slowly but firmly pull up on the chip away from the motherboard. You do not want to just rip it off, but you're going to feel the adhesive coming undone from the motherboard itself. Again, you want to be gentle and firm with this. You don't want to be super fast, just take your time and just apply a bit of firm pressure as you're pulling up. But as you can see here, it's not the cleanest job, but the adhesive actually ended up breaking off and I was able to remove the glitch chip itself. From here, you just want to be a bit gentle, and you can of course use more isopropyl alcohol on this, but I just worked on cleaning and removing the rest of the adhesive from the motherboard itself, just so we don't have anything left behind from this chip. I also took isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips and decided to clean up all the points where the chip was installed to, because for some reason, and I do not know why, but for whatever reason, maybe this is just mostly for testing back then, I did not clean up my old flux residue, which don't be like me back in the day. Just make sure you clean up your old flux and your new flux as well too. I did the exact same thing on the bottom as well too, where the yellow and blue wires were soldered in, so just make sure everything is nice and clean. Now on the bottom of the motherboard, we can start preparing and tinning our points that we're going to solder to. I'm going to keep all the wiring on the bottom of the motherboard itself. Now I'm going to show you all right here. If you are using a Trinity motherboard, there's going to be these 3 points that you need to prepare. So for all of these, I would recommend just taking some isopropyl alcohol and Q-tips, cleaning up the point, fluxing them with a little bit of flux, and then tinning them with some fresh solder. If you are using a Corona motherboard for this, I'm going to have a different image shown up on screen because they are going to be a bit different here. Now, do keep in mind that if you're using a Corona, it's going to depend on which version of Corona that you have. If you have a Corona version 1 or version 2 motherboard, you're going to be using the post point on the bottom. However, if you use a Corona version 3, 4, 5, or 6, you're going to need a postfix adapter installed at the top of the motherboard, and you're going to be using the postfix adapter to install over to instead of the post point on the bottom. Now with all that prepared, let's go ahead and get the hardest part out of the way. At this point, we're going to expose the PLL or PLL bypass point. And this is going to be directly underneath on the bottom of the motherboard. It's going to be underneath where the X clamp was, which is why we had to remove the X clamp. You're going to come over here, over where PLL is, and you're going to look for C5R35. And the point we're looking for is there is a via that we need to expose, and it's going to be pretty much microscopic. So for this, I'm actually going to be pulling out my microscope and show you everything up close and personal. Now right here, you're going to need to scrape this via, and you're going to need to use something like the sharp end of a pair of tweezers, or what I use is an X-Acto knife. Now, I've also been recommending this here, thanks to some recommendations through comments on the channel, just taking a little piece of Captain tape. I really like using Captain tape for these installs, but take a little piece of Captain tape, and I would recommend, this is just some free insurance, to cover this line right here. I recommend this because this here is a trace, and if you end up severing this trace, you can damage your system. So if we cover this while we're doing this scraping part, then we don't need to worry all too much. Now what you'll need to do is, just like I've shown in other videos, but if you haven't seen this before, you're going to want to come in with something such as an X-Acto knife, and there is barely any pressure I'm applying to this here. Essentially, you're just going to kind of run this here back and forth on this via, and be sure to take your time with this. If things get a little bit too dirty or there's a little bit too much silkscreen here, you can just take a Q-tip and some isopropyl alcohol and clean up the debris from here and then continue working. What you're going to want to do is make sure the via is nicely exposed, it is shiny, and it is visible. and it should look a little something like this. This is really how we want it to look. Again, this is an incredibly small point, so take your time and use magnification if you can. Once your point is nice and shiny and accessible, we can then take a little bit of flux, dab it on here, and we're going to prepare this with some solder to get it all tinned. So all you need to do is bring in your soldering iron, bring in some fresh solder, and make sure it tins. Be very generous with your solder here, but I'll say that this point is so small that even if you're generous with your solder, not that much is going to be getting onto this via. And from here, let's go ahead and get our first wire tacked in. So this is going to be one end of the wire that has been soldered to your resistor. So from here, you're just going to want to come in and solder your wire onto this point. Now, this is not going to look the cleanest. I ended up using some new wire on this install, and the issue is when I was introducing any type of heat to this, the insulation on the wire just ended up burning off. So typically I would recommend trimming it back a little bit, but I wanted to keep it as non-exposed as possible. So I just came in here and really just used my iron to burn off a little bit of the insulation while I was doing the install. As you can see, it looks a little something like this. It's not the prettiest looking, mind you, when it comes to that burned insulation, but the actual point is nice and shiny and good to go, and that is fine. That is what we're looking for. Next up, we're going to take the other end of that wire, which has a resistor solder to it, and we're going to solder it to SMC PLL. This is where you're going to be going here on a Trinity motherboard. It's going to be near the front of the board, and it's going to be the FT2V1 point. When you tack it in, it should just look a little something like this. You're just going to want to make sure, again, your point has been fluxed, tinned, and then just solder your wire to it, and you should be good with half of the install at this point. If you are doing this on a Corona motherboard, your point is going to look a little bit different. You're going to be coming over to this section here for the other end of that wire, which has a resistor, and you're going to solder it into DB3R4. You now have half the install done. So let's go ahead and take another piece of small wire, and we're going to solder one end into SMC post. If you're going to be soldering it into a Trinity motherboard, you're going to look for this point here, which is R3R22, and this is where you're going to solder it in. Again, excuse the wiring here, I just had to work with, that new insulation on this. But if you're doing this on a Corona motherboard, I'm going to have this up. It will look a little bit different, but you're going to be soldering that into this point right here, similar to where the Trinity point is, but it's going to be different on a Corona board. Now for the other end of that wire, if you have a Trinity motherboard or you have a Corona version 1 or Corona version 2, you're going to come over to this section near one of the holes for the heatsink pegs, and you're going to be looking for this line right here, like this area where all these pads are. You're going to be looking for post, and this is the point where we need to solder the other end of that short wire into. Once you get it soldered into post, congratulations. If you have a Corona version 1, version 2, or a Trinity, you are done with the RGH3 install. That's all the wiring that needs to be done. However, if you have a Corona version 3, 4, 5, or 6, you're going to need a postfix adapter. Now the good news is here, since this video is for pre-modified systems, if you need a postfix adapter, you should already have a postfix adapter already installed. So for this, you just need to take that other end of the wire. If you just want to make it easy for yourself, just solder it to the same point that the old wire was soldered to. And at that point, you are now done if you have a Corona version 3, 4, 5, or 6. Before we move away from all the wires, let's go ahead and clean up our work. For this, easy enough, just take some Q-tips, isopropyl alcohol, and clean up gently but really well all of the points. Before we flip the console right side up, let's go ahead and secure our wires down as well. Now, you can use whatever you want to here, electrical tape, hot glue, Captain tape. I personally really like Captain tape, so what I would recommend is get your wires lined up and then just use some Captain tape to make sure the wires are nice and secured to the bottom of the console itself. So now we need to work on a cleanup here before we apply fresh new thermal paste. Now you can use whatever you want to remove the old thermal paste from the heatsink itself and on the top of the IHS here. What I personally do is I still like to use Arctic Clean, so I use the 1-2 solution where the first one is just to remove the old thermal paste. I put a little bit on here, let it marinate for a minute or two, and then I clean it off with some paper towels. Do this on the IHS and do it on the bottom of the heatsink. And I do this maybe 2 or 3 times to make sure it's all removed. After that, I then take the purifier solution and do the same thing. Run it on both of these 1 or 2 times. However, you can do the same thing using isopropyl alcohol as well too if you wish to. Once this is all clean, shiny, and ready to go, I then take my thermal paste. I personally use Arctic brand MX4, and then I apply a bead of it, a little something like this on here. You can spread it out if you want to. Everyone has their own way of applying thermal paste. For me, I personally like to just put a glob in the middle and then let science do the work when I reapply pressure with everything. What I personally do after I apply the glob is I then move the motherboard, I take the heatsink that is accompanying this, flip it upside down, and then I apply the motherboard on top of the heatsink upside down. Just make sure you're eyeing everything properly and you're gently doing this. And once applied, you can then take your X-clamp and start putting it back on. From here, you're going to work backwards where you can take the X-clamp, pop it onto one of the legs for the heatsink itself, and then come over to the opposite end, insert it in the same way you did before. And from here, you're going to do a little bit of a thing where I'd recommend taking one finger, pushing down on that side of the X-clamp, and while you're doing so, also gently pry and lift up on it so you're able to pop it onto the peg and then release. And if it matters at all, if you see that oval in the middle of the X-clamp, I also like to have it front facing towards the front of the console itself. Once the X-clamp has been reinstalled, you can flip the console right side up and make sure you reconnect the fan to the motherboard itself, because we don't want to bake our console once this is all done. Now let's go ahead and do a test of our work. For this, go ahead, take the motherboard, pop it into the chassis. I'd recommend screwing it in as well too. Also connect up the RF board and make sure that the faceplate is connected. From here, you can now turn on the console, and if it boots up successfully, congratulations, you are done with RGH3. It's as easy as that. Just to check it out, observe your work, and make sure we have some good boot times, I'd recommend turning it off and on a few times. So you can make sure it boots up into retail by pressing the power button, and also when you turn it off, press the eject button and make sure it boots up into Zell. If it's insta-booting or close to insta-booting, congratulations, you are all good to go. This personal console here, after testing it a bit, I've noticed that probably 9 out of 10 boots, it might have failed to boot up one time, but the rest of the times, it was insta-booting. So it was booting up within 5 seconds easily every single time. And once you feel confident in your work and you make sure your console has been tested, you can now just work backwards on reassembling the console. And as you can see here, we now have the same console reassembled, and it is booting up just as reliably as a retail system. Except it's not retail, it is a RGH3 modified system. Anyways, that is about it for this video here. Hopefully this helped some of you all out, and if you weren't watching it for a help video, hopefully it was entertaining, because we were able to convert this old dinosaur RGH2 install over to RGH3. If you're in this same boat here, would I recommend this? In my opinion, if you are willing to tinker around with it, if you're wanting to take apart your console, and you are capable with soldering and scraping here, I would say this is absolutely a worthwhile upgrade if you are doing this on a single NAND solution console. For this here, as I said, I was using an old RGH2 setup, and the boot times were just not super great, not something that I was happy with. So for this now, going to pretty much insta-booting every single time without even needing a chip, it's fantastic. And the chip can now just go into my chip collection, I suppose. Anyways, that is about it for this video here. I'm going to be enjoying this system, but this is Mr. Mario, signing off. Thank you all for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, a like would absolutely be appreciated, and if you didn't like it, A dislike is fine as well too.